Rightio. Okay, thanks for joining us again. This is Sean Banayan from Kaizen Consulting, and we're just talking about legal and other requirements registers. So, Sean, what's the purpose of having a legal and other requirements register?
So it's one of those things that a business needs to think, what are the risks that we are exposed to in terms of compliance and regulatory requirements? What do we need to comply with? So management team need to get together to identify all those regulatory requirements. So they could be, the product specific requirements from clients. They could be, about, privacy acts and, some of the generic ones which applies to everyone, such as Privacy Act, Employment Act. Those apply to everyone. But you need to know how they apply to you. So you need to say, okay, Health and Safety at Work Act 2015, how does it apply to us? You can't just have a register and say, we know it applies and we comply to it, because you need to define which part of it applies to you. And then, for example, working at height may not apply to you. So you can't just say, as a blanket rule, we comply to the entire regulatory requirement or to the entire act with all the details of it. So as a company, you need to first define what regulatory requirements you have and which one of them apply to you, and then you need to also go through it and review it on the specifics of what actually applies to your business and what you're doing about it. And that becomes a legal requirement, legal and regulatory requirement register.
Right up front, you're looking at what scope, what scope of these standards or these regulations do they meet your business? Is that what you're doing?
Yes, because as I said, you typically see a register of, they would say, for example, Health and Safety at Work Act, and then the next column, reviewed, and we're in compliance with it. You can be challenged from an auditing point of view from the ISO side of things, but putting that aside, as a business, you don't want to take the risk of not knowing what you need to comply with. Up until today, we visit a lot of businesses that they're quite surprised to know that they have a regulatory requirement of doing 6 monthly fire evacuation, and they think it was just a nice thing to do. So they actually haven't reviewed what their compliance requirements are when it comes down to that part of the regulation. So you need to know what regulation applies to you and then go through them, even if it's table of contents. So sometimes even just going through the table of contents and say, does that sound like something we would do? And then go to the section. Otherwise, just go through the table of contents. And with a lot of them, there are actually guides. So you don't need to go through the entire Health and Safety at Work Act, which is a couple of hundred pages. You can go through I think it's called Introduction to Health and Safety at Work Act guide that WorkSafe has published. So that's only 70, 80 pages. So with majority of these regulatory requirements, there are guides that are just much user-friendlier in terms of reading and understanding that regulatory requirement which businesses can go through. At least that's much better than just saying Health and Safety at Work that will comply. And again, involving relevant managers and relevant parties within the business is quite important as well. So you would have, so for example, your HR manager or CFO would have a much better understanding of how Employment Act applies to you rather than you asking your purchasing manager, So that's the whole purpose of getting the whole management team to discuss it, because every person within their area, just by nature of doing their job and being experienced in what they do, by nature they would know what applies to them. So this is, this whole register is really collating that knowledge from everyone.
Ongoing, once you've done that, how often and how frequent should you review that? Is that a regular thing? Because in these days of COVID-19, I suppose some of these compliance managers have got a bit of time on their side. Is now a good time to review those legal registers?
It definitely is. By unfortunately, you know, review of compliance or compliance in general, it's always, it's always something that you need to do on top of your 40 hours job. So there are, even with the compliance management managers, so there are day-to-day activities that will just consume your 40 hours, and then review of registers, review of compliance, review of trends of data, always stay in the back burner of, I'll do that when I have time. So rightly so, you mentioned that, now is a great opportunity to actually catch up with some of those overdue tasks, review of things, putting some data together in terms of, the trend of how you're managing your, the different aspects of the compliance, whether it's accidents, environmental, quality, client requirements. The review frequency of it needs, so you need to itemize that. You can't just say this entire register needs to be reviewed every month or every year, because there are some elements of that register that you need to review that more frequently, and then some others that you need to review that less frequently. In saying that, the best approach that I think is more practical is to say, for example, from Health and Safety at Work Act, what applies to us, and then you need to create events for those ones. Then by nature, you have already reviewed the compliance requirements. So instead of just reviewing the regulatory act for sake of reviewing it, you need to say, for the first time that you're reviewing it, you say, what applies to us? So we need to review our risk register. Let's create an event on that. So we get reminders, and whether it's on our calendar or we're using, softwares. Let's put this reminder in place, so we know that this applies to us and we need to do it, rather than keep going back to reviewing the compliance requirement. The review of your register needs to be only review whether they are still up to date or a new regulation or has been obsolete. In my view, review of that register, that's the purpose of reviewing that register. Otherwise, you need to have processes in place to make sure you're compliant. Privacy Act, how does it apply to us? So for example, for our business, Privacy Act applies to us that, when we finish a project, after 2 months, we create an event that after 2 months, so every 2 months, we actually have an event that I go through, and all the clients that we close the project, I archive those or delete their files if we don't need to refer to it. So I don't need to go back and review Privacy Act again, because I know that's one of the things that applies to us, for example. So Health and Safety at Work, that you could have events on reviewing your risk register, reviewing your accident register, reviewing your PPE requirements, all the different elements. You need to have processes in place. You need to have events on reviewing them. Then by nature, you have already reviewed the entire compliance requirement. That review only needs to be, is there a new Health and Safety at Work Act, or is this still the latest one, or has there been any amendment to it?
Yeah, perfect. Okay, thanks for that, Sean. You've answered all my questions brilliantly. So
Cool.
Thanks again. Hopefully you can join us at another subsequent session where you can answer some tricky questions that we come up against every so often. So thanks for joining us, Sean.
No worries. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Much appreciated. If you enjoyed that video, click on this link here and see how you can conduct remote internal audits.